What are the basic strategies for a king and pawn versus king endgame? Imagine a chessboard where the fate of the game hangs on a single pawn and two kings. This scenario is not just a test of skill but also of strategy and understanding of the endgame. In this situation, the player with the pawn aims to promote it to a queen, while the player with only the king must prevent this from happening. First, it is essential to understand the concept of opposition. The player with the king should aim to control the squares in front of the pawn, effectively blocking its advance. The king can take a position directly opposite the opponent's king, which is known as being in opposition. This positioning is vital as it allows the king to maintain control over the pawn's movement. Next, the player with the pawn must work to advance it while keeping their king close. The king should support the pawn, ensuring it can move forward safely. The ideal strategy involves moving the king in tandem with the pawn, creating a barrier that the opposing king cannot cross. Another important tactic is the concept of the square of the pawn. This square is formed by imagining a square that extends from the pawn to the 8th rank and the same file. If the opposing king is outside this square, the pawn can successfully promote. If the king is within this square, the player must be cautious, as the opposing king can intercept the pawn. When the pawn reaches the 5th rank, the dynamics change. The player with the pawn can often force the opposing king away, allowing the pawn to advance further. The king should always aim to stay in front of the pawn, guiding it toward promotion. Lastly, if the pawn successfully promotes to a queen, the game shifts dramatically. The player with the queen must then checkmate the opposing king, which requires knowledge of basic checkmating patterns. In summary, mastering the strategies for a king and pawn versus king endgame involves understanding opposition, supporting the pawn with the king, recognizing the square of the pawn, and knowing how to convert a pawn promotion into a checkmate. Each move counts, and careful planning can lead to victory.